There's just too many baby boomers. I mean, you look at the demographic chart, every single one of you fuckers could buy a business and it wouldn't be enough. You could buy two and it wouldn't be enough, because just look at the number of baby boomers versus the next generations. There aren't enough of us to buy these businesses. Now, the flip side of that is like, you got to buy them at the right price, the right terms, and the easy to buy businesses will be quite competitive. Yeah.
I was reading your incredible new book, and you mentioned about the silver tsunami that's happening in America. Tell me about the silver tsunami. What's happening today?
You know, rich people have a secret, and they know that if you want to become truly wealthy, the only way you get there is through ownership. And you can do that in lots of different ways. But if you don't have some sort of ownership, very hard to become very wealthy. And there's a problem, though, with that. And the problem is that Americans in the 1800s, we owned about 80% of us owned a business. We were a nation of owners. Today, 6 to 10% of us own a business. And that is really problematic for a lot of reasons, but maybe the most important reason is because 68% of millionaires in the US own a business. So if you want to become a millionaire, you need to own a business, and yet increasingly we do not own businesses. And you know we're not doing a good job because Canada has a 7.6% ownership. So when the Canadians are beating us, we're in trouble. And, you know, and then you might go, okay, well, what's happening? Who's stealing our ownership? And in my opinion, there's many groups, but one primarily is private equity. And if you look at private equity ownership of businesses in 2000, it was about 4%. 2020, it was 20%. And I don't think it's just them alone, and they're not evil guys. I used to be in private equity, so I should know this all too well. They're really actually brilliant. It's all about incentive alignment. And so we have big corporations and we have big government, and the big government is incentive aligning through carried interest allotments, tax incentives, allowance for lower interest rates if you have pooled capital, securities loans, all these things that sound not interesting if you don't have money. It sounds too complex. This allows the really, really big to have an unfair advantage to ownership, in my opinion. And so with all of that happening, that's very hard to push back against. As a normal human, you're like, okay, what am I going to do with that? You know, sure, quote unquote, I don't like Blackstone, or I don't like BlackRock, or whatever words that people say when they talk about these big industries. But there's not much a normal person can do. And then I started realizing about 3.5 years ago that there is a weird generational wealth creation event, in my opinion. These don't happen that often, right? You have like the internet age. You could say we have the AI age right now, maybe too soon to tell. But we have a baby boomer generation that owns 60% of all small businesses in this country. You look at the demographic chart, it's actually staggering for everybody. That's like, everybody's doing it. I'm like, every single one of you fuckers could buy a business and it wouldn't be enough. You could buy two and it wouldn't be enough, because just look at the number of baby boomers versus the next generations. There aren't enough of us to buy these businesses. And so I think we have a much bigger risk actually of not buying them. Now, the flip side of that is like, you got to buy them at the right price, the right terms, and the easy to buy businesses will be quite competitive. So I think we have an interesting point to take back some of the wealth from concentrated powers and diversify wealth. And that is by buying these small businesses that are too small for private equity. They're too small for big corporations. They're really hard to aggregate, and they're perfect for somebody who maybe wants a little bit of ownership and skin in the game. And so that's the idea of what's happening today.
It's really interesting because I think when you look at the real estate world and you look at single family rentals, the mass American does own single family rentals. They actually own more single family rentals than institutional owners like the private equity guys we're talking about. Meanwhile, Main Street is so far behind. Why do you feel like that is the case with small businesses, that we're so far behind?
Well, I think we have had since Bill Clinton said the American dream was owning a house, we have had government programs to incentivize home ownership. We have had a normalization of home ownership as part of the American dream. We don't at all think it's weird that you would get a mortgage and buy a house, right? Even though a house is actually a liability. It doesn't cash flow for you. The house has one of the lowest rates, or single family homes have one of the lowest rates of return, right? Yeah. Real estate market 3 to 4%, stock market 10%, private equity 12 to 15%. So we've sort of normalized this liability as the American dream, which is okay and maybe nice in some ways. But we certainly haven't normalized business ownership in that same way. And you could say there's a myriad of reasons. More volatile, harder to do, requires a lot of grit and determination. Anybody who's owned a business of any type knows that there's a day where you really wish you didn't. Like, we've all had it. You're like, the thing is, I'd like to be an employee today. Like, I get it. And so I think for those reasons, but my prediction is in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years that buying a business will be just as normal as maybe commercial real estate and normalizing along the lines of small business. But to date, we just haven't had the incentive programs and people didn't talk about it. I mean, when I started talking about this 3.5 years ago on the internet, people thought I was crazy. Like, and when I first started buying businesses, let's say 10 years ago, like quietly by myself, I don't know who I could have turned to look for doing that. Like, that didn't exist as far as I knew it. You could look at Warren Buffett, but come on, Codie, then Warren, like there's a little bit of a canyon there. And so normal people weren't really talking about buying these small businesses. In fact, I did it on the side because I was a little bit embarrassed, like Goldman Sachs to a laundromat. That's weird, and also, can I do two at once? How do people feel about that? Am I going to get fired from this job I make a ton of money at? So I think there are a lot of reasons why that wasn't that normal, but that is changing now. And, first time on the Wall Street Journal, they've had HVAC owners as millionaires. Like, I was laughed at for that 3.5 years ago. And so I think people are waking up to it, but there will be a lot of pushback. I mean, you know this all too well in finance, but, in finance, I think we are very smart as an industry. This is a smart industry of people in finance. Mm-hmm. But we also really benefit from not normalizing finance. We benefit at the cost of 2 and 20. We benefit from more ownership and from people giving us their dollars to invest. BlackRock and Blackstone can buy more houses and more businesses if we don't know how to invest, because we give them our money and they use that money, but then they also get a decreased interest rate. Let's say we get 8%, they might get 3% because of pooled capital. Then they have $100 million, let's say, from all of us. Well, then they can take a levered loan on it at a 90% rate potentially, and they can have 2 to 3x our money. And so there's a lot of reasons why people don't want you to think that you can buy an individual business. Not because people are evil, but incentives matter.
I totally agree with you. I mean, when you look at Warren Buffett, for instance, most people don't realize Warren Buffett didn't start out buying stock and buying $100 million businesses. Yep. He started out buying $15, $20, $30 million businesses at the end of the day. And where did most of his best returns come from? The smaller assets.
You're right.
And so I totally agree.